To all who come to this happy podcast, welcome. Welcome to This Happy Place, a Disney podcast. I'm going to be starting a series where I will review all 63 Disney movies to come from the Walt Disney Animation Studios. But before I start with that series, I thought it would be fun to take a look at the different eras of Disney animation. These eras aren't officially recognized by Disney, but they are largely accepted by the fan community. Depending on where you look, the names of these eras could be different, and the movies in them could differ as well, but generally all lists are very similar. An era is generally determined by a few factors: the technology used to make the movie, a shared common history of the both in and out of the studios, and overall reception financially and critically to the movies. Going over these eras will give us a more holistic view of Disney animation, making it easier for us to see how the studio has developed over time. Let's get into the first era, which is the Golden Age, which lasted from 1937 to 1942. The movies in this era are Snow White, Pinocchio, Fantasia, Dumbo, and Bambi. When you usually think about something in the Golden Age, you are talking about someone or something that is at its peak of quality, success, and full of prosperity. I wouldn't blame you if you looked back on the Golden Age and assumed that every movie that was put out was a massive success. But you would actually be wrong thinking that way. In fact, Snow White was the only bona fide success in this era, with Dumbo being just a mild success. When this is referred to as the Golden Age, it's not referring to how successful it was. The term golden, rather, is referring to how Disney set the gold standard for the full-length feature animated film. Despite the majority of these movies in this era not performing well financially, they were all critically acclaimed, getting recognition from everyone for how well these movies were crafted. These movies set the gold standard for what animation could look like and achieve. There was a lot of emphasis on making these movies look artistic. The backgrounds got just as much attention as the foreground, making everything vibrant and exciting. It was a huge thing to sync sound to motion, especially with animation, but they didn't stop there when it came to what you could do with sound in movies. The score in these movies are better than they have any right being. Snow White, Pinocchio, Dumbo, and Bambi all got nominated for the Best Original Score at the Oscars, with Pinocchio and Dumbo winning the award. Snow White, Pinocchio, Dumbo, and Bambi got nominated for Best Original Song, with Pinocchio and Dumbo winning. Of course, Pinocchio won, because how could When You Wish Upon a Star not win that award? This era was also called the Tar and Sugar era. This refers to the fact that these movies have pretty dark and eerie scenes, but they are sandwiched between brighter and more lovable scenes. Think of Pleasure Island in Pinocchio, or the hunter killing Bambi's mom in Bambi, or even the skeleton ride in Fantasia. I think a better name for this era would simply be The Beginning or The Groundbreakers, as these movies really made it possible for animation to exist in the way it does today, even though most of these movies weren't successes. The wartime era or the package film era is the next era, and that came from 1943 to 1949. The movies in this era include Saludos Amigos, The Three Caballeros, Make Mine Music, Fun and Fancy Free, Melody Time, and The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. I wouldn't blame you if you've only heard of one or maybe even zero of these movies. For the most part, these movies have been largely forgotten about by the public and even Disney themselves. Apart from a ride in Epcot or the Mr. Toad ride in Disneyland, these movies really haven't stayed in the Disney zeitgeist at all. Like I said, one name for this era is the wartime era. Yes, these movies did come out during World War II, but the war had a big effect on what was happening at the studio. Towards the beginning of the war, the U.S. government was afraid that the Axis powers were going to try and recruit South America towards their cause of the war. To try and prevent this, the U.S. government enlisted Disney and some other crew members to go on a goodwill ambassador tour of South America. This gave Walt the inspiration for his next film, Saludos Amigos, which was more of an educational film to teach others about South America. They eventually made a sequel, The Three Caballeros, which focused more on Central America and Mexico. Another characteristic of this era is the fact that the size of the studio dwindled. Not only were there huge layoffs due to financial disasters like Pinocchio and Fantasia, but a lot of the Disney animators actually got drafted into the war, making the studio severely understaffed. They didn't have the manpower to make full-length feature films, and the studio couldn't survive with only making short movies. To get around this, they made a bunch of animated short films and put them together into one movie. That's where this era gets its other name, the packaged film era. These packaged films acted a lot like the Silly Symphony animated shorts that the company had lots of success with. Each segment of these films allowed animators to experiment with different animation techniques. Apart from the first two movies in this era, The Three Caballeros and Saludos Amigos, the other films were simply made to keep Disney afloat. The war was still making it near impossible to get Disney films sent out internationally, and the biggest source of income to the studio was actually from the US government, who was paying Disney to make animated propaganda shorts. It was actually at this point in history where Donald Duck became more popular than Mickey Mouse, because Donald Duck was the main character in these propaganda shorts. The next era is the Silver Film era, which lasts from 1950 to 1967. Movies in this era include Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, Lady and the Tramp, Sleeping Beauty, 101 Dalmatians, The Sword and the Stone, and The Jungle Book. This is the era that I feel like most people think of when they think classic Disney. Rather than calling this film the Silver Era, I prefer calling it the Restoration Era. The war ended, animators were able to come back, and Disney was able to make animated movies with that sense of high art that they used to do. They were also able to expand on the technology that animators used during the wartime era. The Disney studio was being restored to the way they used to do things. They had the manpower to make movies look beautiful again. They could create iconic music for each film. One person who was very crucial in this era was Mary Blair. Mary was a color artist and color designer for Disney that not only worked on movies, but stuff for the theme parks as well. She brought a modern art look to Disney animation. Everyone at Disney loved Mary Blair, and everyone couldn't speak higher of Blair's art style. Here are just some things that have been said of her. Animator Mark Davis said, "She brought modern art to Walt in a way that no one else did." He was so excited about her work. Frank Thomas, another animator, said, "Mary was the first artist I knew of to have different shades of red next to each other. You just didn't do that, but Mary made it work." Then, Imagineering legend Roland Crump said, "The way she painted, in a lot of ways, she was a little girl. Walt was like that. You could see he could relate to children. She was the same way." I just love that one. That's probably my favorite quote about Mary Blair. A lot of similarities have also been drawn between these films and Walt's life. Walt saw himself in all of these films. For example, Cinderella, a movie about the fact that your dreams can come true, and Peter Pan, emphasizing the importance of a youthful spirit. The next era is called the Bronze Era, which lasted from 1970 to 1988 and then also 1990. The films in this era include Aristocats, Robin Hood, The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh, The Rescuers, The Fox and the Hound, The Black Cauldron, The Great Mouse Detective, Oliver and Company, and The Rescuers Down Under. Although most people put The Rescuers Down Under in the next era, I feel like it is more similar to the movies in this era. It did come out after The Little Mermaid, which did come out after Oliver and Company, so there is a little rearranging that needs to be done as far as that chronologically goes. This is the era immediately following the passing of Walt Disney. Walt was the creative force behind everything at the studio, so when he was gone, the studio didn't know what to do. They didn't know what direction to start going. Not only was Walt gone, but the animators that worked the closest with him started to retire. What was left was a group of aging animators and a group of young new animators coming over from Caltech. This was a classic case of different generations butting heads. The younger generation wanted to be more experimental and edgy, while the veterans wanted to continue doing what worked out so well in the previous era. It ended up not really mattering in the end because the movies in this era were not commercially successful. They had a few moderate successes like Oliver and Company, but those were rare. It was another time for Disney where animation was really struggling. To help cut back on cost, they relied heavily on an animated technique called xerography. This was first used in 101 Dalmatians, but it was a cornerstone of this era. This technique allowed animators to copy their drawings onto animation cells rather than tracing them in ink. You couldn't use ink to make the transfer, so it was mainly used with something like a pencil, and that made it so the films didn't look as smooth. Characters weren't traced with ink, and they didn't have a smooth outline around them. Another name for this era is the scratchy film era because the overall look didn't seem as refined. It was also during this time where Disney started releasing their classics on VHS home video. This was a massive success for Disney, but the bad thing was people wanted to watch these Disney classics more than the Disney movies that were actually coming out, and that was a huge problem. Good thing the Disney Renaissance came, which is our next era, which lasted from 1989 to 1999. The movies in this era included The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, The Lion King, Pocahontas, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Hercules, Mulan, and Tarzan. This is an era that most people remember, and for good reason, especially the first 4 films in this era, as they are considered to be some of Disney's best. This era is marked by having a new leadership change, mainly Michael Eisner as CEO, and it's actually hard to believe, but Eisner wanted to shut down Disney Animation because it wasn't a profitable division of the company. Can you imagine if he actually did shut down Disney Animation? That's just crazy to think about. The biggest characteristic of these movies are the songs are very Broadway-like. The one whose name you might be most familiar with is Alan Menken, who wrote the Broadway musical Little Shop of Horrors. These movies got back to the roots of the princess film. The Little Mermaid in 1988 was Disney's first princess film since Sleeping Beauty, which came out in 1959. The music was consistently excellent, winning numerous awards. Here's a little bit of fun trivia for you. Beauty and the Beast was the first animated film to be nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars, and there wasn't even an animated film category yet. 3 of its songs got nominated for Best Song, Beauty and the Beast, Belle, and Be Our Guest. And that has never been done before, and it still remains a record. Beauty and the Beast did win the Oscar for Best Song. These songs were easy to remember and hum to yourself later on. Kids could pick up these songs and sing them for hours and hours and hours. These films also started to experiment with using computers to animate specific moments in them. Not full scenes, but little things here and there. I was tempted for my own list of eras to split the whole Renaissance into 2 separate eras. Because after The Lion King in '94, these movies didn't perform very well financially and weren't that interesting to the audience. DreamWorks was an up-and-coming animation studio at this time, and they were recruiting animators from Disney to come work for them. To combat this, Disney offered very lucrative contracts to animators to get them to stay at Disney, but they got very expensive very quickly, and that only hurt them more when the movies weren't making that much money. They struggled to get any sort of profit if they got one at all. And in 1995, the same year that Pocahontas came out, Pixar's first movie, which at this point Pixar was not owned by Disney, but they were in a strong partnership, Toy Story came out in 1995, and audiences favored that over Pocahontas. In fact, it got to the point where every Pixar movie was favored over every Disney movie in these years. You can argue the quality of the movies in this era, but I would in fact say that all these movies are at least good. But one thing you can't argue is with how the end of this era put Disney into another financial hardship. It wasn't going to get better with the next era, which was the post-Renaissance from 2000 to 2008. The movies in this era are Fantasia 2000, Dinosaur, The Emperor's New Groove, Atlantis: The Lost Empire, Lilo and Stitch, Treasure Planet, Brother Bear, Chicken Little, Meet the Robinsons, and Bolt. With Disney's close relationship to Pixar at this time, they were able to use some of the same technology to make computer animated films. While Chicken Little was the first film by the studio to be made completely computer generated, all of these films had elements that were computer animated. I'm sure if you watch these films again, especially Treasure Planet, you will see how there's a little bit of computer technology animation in there. While it's good to pursue technology, the mix of hand-drawn animation and computer animation was drawing to most audiences. It looked clunky as there wasn't a real focus on hand-drawn or computer animation. Pixar was also continuing its dominating run. Everyone was preferring Pixar to Disney. Disney movies continued to disappoint at the box office. Really, the only notable movie to come out of this era that is still relevant today is Lilo and Stitch. Stitch is literally everywhere. Some of the other movies have massive cult followings like The Emperor's New Groove and Atlantis, but they aren't largely considered to be some of Disney's best, nor are they remembered by the population as a whole. These movies definitely have a cult following with those that grew up with them, but they didn't have that impact that can affect generations. When Bob Iger became CEO, he was watching a parade at one of the Disney parks. He noticed that all the characters on the floats came from movies that were released a decade earlier. Audiences just weren't caring too much about Disney during this time. These films just went away from the princess formula. Which brings us into the last and current era, which is the revival that started in 2009. The movies in this era are Princess and the Frog, Tangled, Winnie the Pooh, Frozen, Wreck-It Ralph, Big Hero 6, Zootopia, Moana, Ralph Breaks the Internet, Frozen 2, Raya and the Last Dragon, Encanto, Strange World, and Wish. The start of this era is marked by the hiring of Bob Iger as CEO, and John Lasseter was brought over from Pixar after Disney acquired Pixar. Lasseter is not with Disney anymore, but his influence at the beginning of this era is one of the main things that establishes this as an era. Disney animators were taught the Pixar way of animation, not only by making the computer animation look better, but Pixar's story philosophy. Disney would return to the old formula that saved them in the Renaissance. We got 4 new princess movies. Seriously, anytime Disney feels like their animation division is struggling, they just need to make another princess movie. But they were also focused on creating more original movies and basing their movies on source material that they never have before. For example, Big Hero 6 is inspired by the Marvel comic by the same name. Wreck-It Ralph, Zootopia, and Moana, even though Moana is inspired by mythology, were all original ideas. 9 of these movies got nominated for the Best Animated Feature Oscar, with Frozen, Big Hero 6, Zootopia, and Encanto taking home that award. The cultural impact from this era is not to be understated. They just came out with The Princess and the Frog ride in both American parks, Disneyland and Disney World. Frozen has a ride in a whole land. Zootopia has its own land in Shanghai. There was just so much care taken into the songs of this era as well. Every musical, apart from Wish, which there should have been a song nominated from Wish, and Moana 2, had a song nominated for Best Song at the Oscars. Let It Go is still a massive song, and who can forget how We Don't Talk About Bruno took over the entire world. We Don't Talk About Bruno was actually the first #1 Disney song on the Billboard charts since Aladdin with A Whole New World. I don't think this era has ended yet. I just think that goes to show how great these movies have been. Are there hiccups? Sure. Every era has a couple of those, but there was never a long streak of them in this era like in others. Not only because of its length of movies, meaning the number of movies in this era, but I think there's a real argument to be made that this is the best Disney era. Could you contribute that to a bit of recency bias? Sure, but most of my Disney movies I watched growing up are from other eras, so I don't have a lot of nostalgia attachment to these movies. But apart from Strange World, I love my time watching every movie of this era, and I can't say that about every other era. This era proved that Disney animation could evolve while still honoring its legacy. We will see what the average ranking of this era is compared to others as I start my series of ranking all Disney 3 animated movies while I review them. I can't wait to go on this journey with all of you. Thank you for listening to this Happy Place at Disney podcast. And remember, there is a great big beautiful tomorrow shining at the end of every day.